She sat on the cracked school steps, fists pressed against her cheeks, trying not to cry. The reason? Her shoes. Not the glittering sneakers or satin flats her classmates wore, but scraps of fabric, unevenly stitched by her mother's tired hands. "Did you make those out of trash?" The laughter had stung, and she had fled. But when a billionaire CEO, once a boy who knew that same shame, stopped and noticed her, everything changed. What began as humiliation would ignite a movement the world would never forget. The little girl sat on the cracked concrete steps outside the school building, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding them together could stop the burning sting behind her eyes. The laughter still echoed in her ears, high-pitched and cruel, the kind of laughter that lingered long after the words themselves had faded. She looked down at her feet, at the shoes. They weren't like the others. They weren't white leather sneakers with flashing soles or glittering ballet flats with satin bows. They were made from scraps of fabric her mother had stitched together with thread too thick for the delicate seams, their shapes uneven, their colors mismatched. To anyone else, they looked like a patchwork mistake. To her, they looked like home. Her mother had spent hours hunched over the small wooden table in their kitchen, eyes straining under the dim bulb, hands raw from work but steady with love. She had whispered, "Now you won't have to go barefoot anymore, sweet pea," and the girl had believed her. But in the fluorescent light of the school hallway, surrounded by shiny shoes bought with money her family could never dream of, those homemade shoes became something else, a target. "Did you make those out of trash?" one girl sneered, clutching her pink designer backpack tighter as her friends howled with laughter. "They look like clown shoes," another added, pointing so everyone could see. The girl tried to tuck her feet under her chair, tried to disappear into the desk, but it was too late. The humiliation clung to her skin like a second layer, hot and suffocating. When the bell rang, she bolted out of the classroom, down the hall, and onto the front steps where she now sat. She pressed her fists against her cheeks, whispering to herself that she wouldn't cry, not here, not where anyone could see. Inside the glass doors, a janitor pushing a mop bucket glanced at her with weary eyes, but said nothing. Teachers passed by in conversation, their voices muffled and distant. No one noticed the little girl sitting small and still, except one man. He hadn't meant to be there, not really. His schedule was supposed to take him from one meeting to another, boardrooms to conference calls, never once crossing paths with an elementary school. But his driver had taken a wrong turn, and rather than sit idly in the back of his car scrolling through emails, he had asked to be let out for a short walk. That man was Ethan Cross. Everyone in the city knew his name. CEO of Cross Industries, the youngest billionaire on the Forbes list, a man whose face appeared on magazine covers as often as it appeared in financial news reports. He was known for precision, his sharp suits, his sharper mind, the empire he had built from a tech startup in a borrowed garage into one of the largest companies in the country. But what people didn't know, because he never told them, was that once, a long time ago, he too had known what it felt like to have nothing. He stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, his eyes catching on the small figure hunched on the school steps. A child, no older than 8 or 9, shoulders drawn in as if she could fold herself into invisibility. Something about the sight stopped him. He slowed, then changed direction, walking toward her. "You okay there?" His voice was deep but gentle, careful not to startle. The girl looked up quickly, eyes wide, cheeks flushed. She shook her head once, then dropped her gaze back to her shoes, as if ashamed to let him see them. Ethan followed her glance. His eyes rested on the shoes, and in that instant, he understood more than she could have guessed. He crouched down so he was at her level, his expensive suit creasing in ways it never usually did. "Those are some pretty unique shoes," he said quietly. Her head snapped up, disbelief flickering in her eyes. "They're ugly," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. Everyone laughed. He studied them for a moment, the stitches uneven, the colors mismatched. And yet, there was something there, not perfection, but intention, not polish, but heart. He saw not what they lacked, but what they represented. Someone had cared enough to make them. They don't look ugly to me, he said. They look like work, like effort. Someone made those for you, didn't they? Her lip trembled, but she nodded. My mom, she didn't want me to go without. Something inside him tightened. He remembered his own mother's hands, red and cracked from cleaning houses, sewing patches into his torn pants because buying new ones wasn't an option. He remembered the sting of classmates' words, the way he used to sit on steps like these, trying not to cry. And suddenly, this wasn't just a child with mismatched shoes. This was him, years ago, alone. What's your name? He asked softly. Lila, she whispered. Lila, he repeated, as if making a promise with her name. Well, Lila, I think your mom gave you something special. And if you ask me, those shoes might just be more valuable than any of the ones your classmates wear. She blinked, not understanding. You'll see, he said, standing again. He adjusted his jacket, his mind already working, already turning this small moment into something larger. Sometimes the world just needs help noticing what's truly valuable. And with that, he left her, confused, but with a flicker of hope she hadn't felt before. The following week, Ethan stood backstage at a crowded auditorium. Reporters filled the seats, cameras poised to capture the unveiling of Cross Industries' latest product line. The stage had been set with meticulous care. Bright lights, massive screens, every detail calibrated for maximum impact. Assistants hurried about, finalizing notes and cue cards. But Ethan wasn't looking at any of it. He was looking at the box in his hands. Inside it were the shoes, Lila's shoes. He had asked around quietly, had one of his staff track down her mother. At first, she had been suspicious, afraid some powerful man was mocking her daughter. But when Ethan sat in her small kitchen and explained, not as a CEO, but as a man who once wore patched clothes himself, she had slowly begun to believe him. He had asked if he could borrow the shoes just for one night. She had hesitated, then nodded. Now, as the crowd hushed, and the host's voice announced his name, Ethan stepped out into the spotlight. Applause erupted, flashes went off, but he didn't smile in the practiced way he usually did. Tonight wasn't about numbers or stock prices. Tonight was about something else entirely. He walked to the center of the stage, set down the sleek black designer shoes he'd been wearing, and slowly, deliberately, pulled on Lila's mismatched homemade ones. The crowd murmured in confusion. Photographers zoomed in. Board members exchanged baffled glances. Ethan let the silence stretch, then finally spoke. Some of you may be wondering what I'm doing, he began, his voice steady, carrying across the vast room. These shoes, they weren't made in a factory. They weren't designed by professionals. They were stitched together by a mother who had nothing, but still gave everything. The room went utterly still. I met a little girl recently, he continued. She was humiliated for wearing these, mocked, laughed at, because the world has a habit of confusing value with price. But when I look at these shoes, I don't see imperfection. I see resilience. I see love. I see something more rare than anything money can buy. Sacrifice. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And so, tonight, I want to make a statement. At Cross Industries, we innovate. We create. But above all, we recognize that greatness often comes from the places people overlook, from the hands the world dismisses, from the hearts that refuse to give up. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, swelling as his words took hold. These shoes, Ethan said, lifting one foot slightly so the mismatched stitching caught the light, will walk this stage tonight, because what the world laughed at yesterday It will respect tomorrow. And with that, he began his keynote presentation, wearing Lila's shoes. Back in her small living room, Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes glued to the flickering television. Her mother sat behind her, hands clasped to her mouth, in disbelief. On the screen, the richest man in the city walked confidently across a stage wearing the very shoes her daughter had been mocked for. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every uneven stitch, every mismatched scrap of fabric. Lila's eyes widened, her chest swelling with something she had never felt before: pride. At school the next morning, everything was different. Where once there had been whispers and laughter, there was now awe. Kids crowded around her desk, eyes wide. "Are those the shoes?" one boy asked, pointing. "The ones the CEO wore?" another chimed in. Lila looked down at her feet, at the same mismatched shoes she had wanted to hide just days earlier. For the first time she smiled. "Yeah," she said quietly, "these are them." And no one laughed. But that was only the beginning. Lila had never imagined that something as small as shoes could hold the power to change her life. To her, they were just the bits of cloth her mother stitched together by candlelight, not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. The rent had swallowed what little money came in, food took the rest, and there was never anything left for things as trivial as footwear. Shoes were a luxury. Survival wasn't. But now the whole world seemed to be staring at them. When Ethan Cross had walked across that brightly lit stage wearing her mismatched shoes, millions of people had seen them. Newspapers printed their photos on the front page. Headlines called it the statement that shook Wall Street. Social media exploded with hashtags: #shoes of love, #crossstep was worth more than gold. Overnight, what had been the source of her deepest shame had become a symbol people admired. Yet for Lila, none of it made sense. She was still the same girl. Her home was still the same cracked apartment with the leaky faucet and the broken heater. Her mother still woke before dawn to clean offices downtown, her hands raw and aching from endless scrubbing. Nothing had changed, and yet somehow everything had. At school, the children who once mocked her now whispered in awe. "That's the girl," one boy murmured in the hallway. "She's the one whose shoes he wore," a girl exclaimed. Lila felt their stares but didn't know what to do with them. Before, she had wanted to disappear. Now she wanted the same thing, but for a different reason. She didn't want to be defined by Ethan Cross. She didn't want pity. She wanted to belong. And then, one afternoon, the black car pulled up outside her school. The entire playground froze as the sleek vehicle glided to a stop, its windows tinted, its presence commanding. A man in a crisp suit stepped out first, scanning the area with professional precision. Then, from the other side came Ethan himself. His tailored coat caught the sunlight, his posture calm yet deliberate, as though even his breathing was rehearsed. Whispers rippled through the children like electricity. Teachers straightened nervously, unsure if they should approach or step back. Ethan ignored them all. His eyes sought only one person. "Lila," he said gently, his voice carrying across the playground as if it knew exactly where to land. Her heart thumped hard against her ribs. For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly she walked forward, her mismatched shoes crunching against the gravel. "You left these behind," Ethan said, holding up a carefully wrapped box. Inside, she knew, were her shoes, the ones he had worn on stage, the ones the whole world had seen. "They belong to you," he added. Her fingers trembled as she took the box. Why did you wear them?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan crouched down so that his eyes met hers, the way he had on the school steps. "Because sometimes the world needs to be reminded what real value looks like. And sometimes," he said, his voice dropping lower, "the smallest things hold the biggest truths." She didn't understand everything he meant, but she felt it. felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. For the first time in her young life, she felt seen. That evening, Ethan sat in his penthouse, the city lights glittering far below like fallen stars. His assistants had left hours ago, but he hadn't moved from the leather armchair by the window. He was holding a photo in his hand. Not one of his usual glossy press shots, but a candid picture taken by a reporter that morning. Him crouched in front of Lila, handing her the box. Her small hands reaching out, her wide, uncertain eyes. The image had already gone viral. But for Ethan, it wasn't about publicity. It was about memory. He saw himself in that child, saw the boy he once was, wearing shoes with holes in the soles, too proud to admit the blisters hurt. He remembered being laughed at. He remembered his mother's tears when she thought he was asleep. And he remembered the silent promise he had made then, that if he ever had power, he would use it differently. Now, decades later, he had more power than he had ever imagined. But the cost of that power was a loneliness that echoed even in rooms full of people. Deals and mergers didn't fill the hollow place inside. But a little girl's eyes on a cracked school step had cracked something open in him that he hadn't realized was closed. And he couldn't ignore it. The following week, invitations went out, not to shareholders, not to politicians, but to children. Ethan announced a new initiative, the Step Forward Foundation. Its mission was simple, to provide shoes, clothing, and opportunities to children living in poverty. But for him, it wasn't just charity, it was justice. He had lived that life. He knew what it felt like, and he refused to let another generation feel invisible. The launch event was held in a renovated warehouse, transformed into a bright, welcoming space filled with music, laughter, and color. Rows of shoes lined the walls, new shoes, sturdy and beautiful, ready to be given away. But at the center of the display, under a glass case, were the mismatched shoes, Lila's shoes. As cameras clicked and reporters scribbled notes, Ethan stood at the podium. He wasn't wearing his usual polished loafers. Instead, he had once again put on the homemade shoes. Their uneven stitches looked almost defiant under the bright lights. "These shoes," he said, "are not just fabric and thread. They are a mother's sacrifice. They are a child's courage. They are proof that value isn't determined by labels or price tags, but by love. And today, they remind us that every child deserves to step forward with dignity." Applause thundered. Reporters called it the most powerful speech of his career. But when Ethan stepped off the stage, he didn't look for the cameras. He looked for Lila. She was there, clutching her mother's hand, her eyes shining with something she couldn't name. When he approached, she whispered, "Everyone was clapping for my shoes?" "No," Ethan said softly, kneeling so only she could hear. "They were clapping for what they represent, for you, for your mom, for every kid who deserves better." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and in that moment something unspoken passed between the three of them. A connection not built on money, but on shared understanding. And so what began as humiliation became transformation. But it didn't end there. The applause still echoed in the vast warehouse, vibrating against the high rafters and hanging in the air like the aftertaste of something rich and rare. For a moment, Ethan stood still on the stage, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt foreign to him. He had given 1,000 speeches in his life, each crafted with precision, each engineered to move markets and sway investors. Yet none had felt like this. None had seemed to matter in the marrow of his bones the way this one did. He looked down at the shoes again, the shoes that had once been laughed at, dismissed, ridiculed, and then at the girl in the front row, small and fragile, but lit with a brightness that seemed too large for her frame. Lila's eyes met his, and for just a second, the rest of the room dissolved. There were no cameras, no investors, no journalists, just a man and a child bound together by the thread of something the world too often overlooked: dignity. When the crowd began to disperse, when reporters rushed forward to shove microphones in his face, Ethan stepped away from the stage. His team tried to corral him, to guide him toward the waiting interviews, but he waved them off. His feet carried him not to the press, but to the small family standing uncertainly near the edge of the room. Lila clutched her mother's hand as if afraid someone might try to pull her away. Her mother, Elena, stood stiffly, her posture betraying both pride and exhaustion. She was dressed in a simple blouse and worn jeans, clothes that spoke of practicality, not fashion. Yet her eyes, dark and steady, carried the quiet fire of a woman who had fought too many battles and refused to surrender to any of them. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, his voice softer now, stripped of the polish he wore for boardrooms. "I wasn't sure you'd want to." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "Men like you don't usually notice girls like my daughter, or women like me." Her words weren't hostile. They were factual, born from years of invisibility. Ethan absorbed them without flinching. He understood more than she realized. "You're right," he said. "Most don't, but maybe that's the problem." Lila shifted, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Everyone clapped for my shoes," she whispered again, as if still testing the reality of it. "No," Ethan corrected gently. "They clapped because of what you and your mom showed the world, that love is worth more than money." For the first time, Elena's expression softened. Her shoulders dropped slightly, the tension easing. And in that subtle movement, Ethan recognized something he hadn't felt in years. Trust. Fragile. Tentative. But there. Over the weeks that followed, the Step Forward Foundation grew faster than anyone anticipated. Donations poured in, factories volunteered surplus stock, shoe companies offered partnerships. Ethan's office buzzed with the kind of energy usually reserved for billion-dollar product launches. But this time, the product wasn't a phone or a gadget. It was hope. Yet with every headline praising his initiative, with every viral post celebrating the CEO with a conscience, came a shadow. Investors muttered that he was distracted. Board members whispered about sentimentality eroding his edge. One rival CEO even went on record calling the shoe stunt a cheap publicity trick. Ethan listened to all of it with the calm patience of a man who had weathered storms before. But inside, something churned. He knew this wasn't a stunt. He knew this was the first real thing he had done in years. And he wasn't about to let anyone twist it into something cheap. Still, the criticism found its way to him in quieter moments. At night, when the city's roar faded to a low hum outside his penthouse, he found himself staring at the shoes, now placed carefully on a stand near his window. He would trace the uneven stitches with his eyes, remembering Lila's voice, Elena's steady gaze, and the boy he once was, who had promised himself never to forget what it felt like to be invisible. And in those moments, he whispered a vow, "Not this time. I won't back down." One rainy afternoon, Ethan found himself once again outside the small apartment where Elena and Lila lived. He hadn't told his team. He hadn't brought cameras. This wasn't for publicity. It was for him. When Elena opened the door, surprise flashed across her face. "Mr. Cross," she said almost stiffly. "Ethan," he corrected gently. "Please, just Ethan." She hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the rich aroma of beans simmering on the stove. The furniture was mismatched, the wallpaper peeling, but everything was spotless. A home built not of wealth, but of care. Lila rushed forward, barefoot this time, her eyes bright. "You came!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with unfiltered joy. Ethan smiled, something rare and genuine that surprised even him. "I said I would, didn't I?" They spent the evening together at that worn kitchen table, eating simple food that tasted better than any Michelin-starred meal Ethan had ever had. Lila chattered about school, about how the other kids no longer laughed at her shoes, about how one girl even asked if she could make her a pair. Elena mostly listened, her eyes darting between her daughter and the man sitting across from her, trying to decipher his intentions. Finally, when Lila had gone to bed, Elena spoke. "Why are you really here?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "Because I don't want this to be a headline. I don't want your daughter to be a symbol for a week and then forgotten. I want this to matter." Her eyes softened, but only slightly. "Symbols fade," she said. "Bills don't." Something in her words struck him deeper than any investor's criticism ever had. He nodded slowly. "Then maybe we need to make sure it's not just about symbols." What began as occasional visits soon turned into something more regular. Ethan found himself drawn back to that small apartment again and again. Sometimes he came with bags of groceries, sometimes with nothing at all, just himself. He sat at that kitchen table, listening to Lila's laughter, watching Elena's guarded eyes gradually thaw. He didn't try to replace what they already had. He didn't offer them mansions or luxury cars. Instead, he offered presence, consistency, a listening ear, and in return, he found something he hadn't realized he was missing: family. But just as the bond deepened, the backlash grew louder. A leaked memo from one of his board members accused him of abandoning fiscal responsibility in favor of personal crusades. Anonymous articles surfaced online, questioning Elena's character, implying she was manipulating Ethan for money. At school, Lila overheard whispers that she was only special because some rich guy felt sorry for her. The weight of it all pressed down on Elena until one night she broke. She stood at the window, arms crossed, her voice tight. "This was a mistake," she said. "You coming into our lives, it's only made things harder for her." Ethan's chest tightened. "You think I don't know what people are saying? You think I don't hear it every day?" His voice cracked, not with anger, but with something rawer. "But Elena, this isn't pity. It never was. This is the first time in years I've felt like I'm doing something that matters." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "And what happens when the world moves on, when the cameras stop caring? My daughter will still be here, still walking into that school, still facing those whispers." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then I'll still be here too, with her, with you." The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile, and in that silence something shifted. Not fully trust, not yet, but a beginning. The months that followed tested them all. Court battles erupted as rival companies tried to discredit Ethan's foundation. Anonymous threats arrived at the office. Investors staged a vote to challenge his leadership. But through it all, Ethan stood firm, and beside him, to his own surprise, stood Elena and Lila. Together they faced the storm, and when at last it passed, when the lawsuits were dismissed, when the investors grudgingly admitted that the foundation had actually boosted the company's reputation rather than harmed it, Ethan knew this was no longer just about shoes, no longer just about a gesture. It was about building something lasting, something real. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the apartment walls in gold, Lila pulled a crayon drawing from her backpack. 6 stick figures stood hand in hand, a mother, a daughter, 4 hearts above them, and a tall man with a crooked smile. At the top, in bright letters, she had written one word: family. Ethan stared at it for a long time, his throat tight, his eyes burning, and in that moment he knew the shoes had changed more than a little girl's life. They had changed his. The crayon drawing sat on the table like a fragile truth. Ethan reached out with careful fingers, tracing the word at the top: family. His throat felt tight, not with the smooth, rehearsed words of a CEO, but with something that stripped him raw. He looked across the table at Lila, who waited, her eyes shimmering with the innocent certainty only a child could carry. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized he wanted desperately to live up to a picture. Elena sat across from him, her arms crossed, her gaze half-guarded and half-weary. She had seen too many promises broken, too many men come and go. She had no illusions left, and though she was grateful for what Ethan had done for her daughter, gratitude was not trust. Not yet. "She drew that because she believes in you," Elena said softly. "Children believe too easily. But belief doesn't pay rent. Belief doesn't protect us when people whisper that we're taking advantage of you." Her words were sharp, but behind them was something like fear. Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "And if I've learned anything in business, it's that words without action are worthless. So let me prove it, not with money, with time, with presence." Lila looked between them, her small face caught in the tension. Then she reached out, tugging at Ethan's sleeve. "Are you staying for dinner?" It was such a simple question, yet in that moment, it was everything. Ethan looked at Elena. She hesitated, then finally gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," Ethan said, "I'm staying." It became a pattern. Once a week at first, then twice, then whenever his schedule allowed. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes a book for Lila, sometimes nothing at all but his presence. He learned to sit at the small table, to laugh at Lila's jokes, to listen as Elena spoke of her long days cleaning offices. The more time he spent there, the less his penthouse felt like home. One evening, as Lila colored at the table, Ethan found himself standing by the sink, sleeves rolled up, washing dishes beside Elena. The water ran warm, the plates clinked softly, and in the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, something inside him softened. "You don't have to do that," Elena said, glancing at him. "I know," he replied, "but maybe I want to." She studied him for a moment, then shook her head. "You don't belong in this kitchen." Ethan paused, turning to look at her. "Maybe this is exactly where I belong." Her eyes flickered, then dropped back to the dish in her hands. She said nothing, but her silence was not rejection. It was possibility. But the world beyond their apartment was not so quiet. The foundation continued to grow, and with it, so did the scrutiny. Tabloids printed photos of Ethan entering Elena's apartment, speculating about their relationship. Talk show hosts joked about Cinderella in sneakers. Investors worried aloud about distractions. And then came the night when Lila came home from school in tears again. "They said Mama's using you," she sobbed, burying her face in Elena's lap. "They said you'll leave us when you're bored." Elena's face hardened, fury and helplessness warring in her eyes. She looked up at Ethan, who stood in the doorway, his chest aching at the sight. He knelt beside Lila, speaking softly but firmly. "Listen to me," he said. "People will always talk. They don't understand what we have. But I'm not leaving. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Do you hear me?" Lila sniffled, lifting her tear-streaked face. "Promise?" "I promise," Ethan said. And for once it wasn't a word to close a deal. It was a vow. The weeks blurred into months. The foundation became a national force, distributing millions of shoes to children in need. Celebrities lent their names. Politicians praised it. But for Ethan, the most important work happened in that small apartment, in the laughter at the dinner table, in the way Elena's eyes softened each time she saw him keep showing up. Yet he knew it wasn't enough. He wanted more. Not to rescue them, they didn't need rescuing, but to belong to them, to make permanent what had begun almost by accident on a cracked school step. And so one evening, after Lila had gone to bed, Ethan sat across from Elena in the quiet kitchen. "I want to be part of this," he said simply. "Not just the foundation, not just as the man who wore her shoes. I want to be part of your lives, officially, fully." Elena froze, her hand tightening around her mug. "Ethan, I'm not asking you to depend on me," he continued. "I'm asking to stand beside you, to walk with you. Because the truth is, you and Lila have given me more than I've given you. You've given me a reason." Her eyes shimmered, but her voice was steady. "Do you know what you're saying? Do you know what it means to tie yourself to someone like me? I don't have money. I don't have status. I'm just a woman who scrubs floors and tries to keep her child safe." Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You have strength. You have love. You have dignity. And those are worth more than anything I've ever bought." The silence stretched. And then, for the first time, Elena let her fingers entwine with his. The proposal came not with diamonds, not with spectacle, but with crayons. One morning, Ethan slid a folded piece of paper across the table. On it was another drawing by Lila, 3 figures this time, holding hands, with the word written in bright red, "Forever." When Elena looked up, tears in her eyes, Ethan simply said, "She's already decided. The only question is, will you?" Her answer was a whisper, but it carried more weight than any boardroom decision he had ever made. Yes. The wedding was small, held in a community hall decorated with paper flowers made by children from the foundation. Lila scattered petals down the aisle with solemn seriousness, her mismatched shoes peeking from under her dress. Elena walked toward Ethan in a simple gown, her eyes steady, her smile trembling but real. When they spoke their vows, Ethan didn't promise riches or protection. He promised presence, partnership, truth. And Elena didn't promise obedience or gratitude. She promised to challenge him, to stand with him, to never let him forget the boy he once was who had worn patched shoes. And when they kissed, the room erupted in applause, not for a CEO or a fairy tale, but for something rarer, love that had been earned, not bought. Years later, the mismatched shoes remained in their glass case at the foundation's headquarters, a symbol for millions. But in their home, the real one, the one filled with laughter and arguments and ordinary mess, Ethan often found Elena sitting quietly, holding the memory of what those shoes had meant. And every time he saw them, he remembered that the world had laughed at a little girl once, until love turned laughter into reverence, until a CEO remembered what it meant to be human, until shoes made from scraps stitched a family together, and that was worth more than all the wealth in the world. The morning after the wedding, sunlight spilled across the modest kitchen, gilding the walls in a soft glow. Elena moved quietly, brewing coffee in a chipped pot, while Ethan sat at the table in a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, no tie, no armor of corporate perfection. He had spent decades waking to luxury sheets and glass walls, but never had a morning felt so real. The sound of water boiling, the faint scrape of a chair as Lila dragged it closer to the table, the smell of bread toasting imperfectly, all of it felt like wealth in a form he had never bought. "Do you still have to go to your big meetings now that you're married?" Lila asked between bites of cereal, her brow furrowed in childish seriousness. Ethan smiled. "Yes, but they feel smaller now." "Smaller?" "Because this," he said, gesturing to the kitchen, "is bigger." Elena gave him a look, half teasing, half surprised. "Careful. If the board hears you say that, they'll faint." He grinned, but deep down he knew she wasn't wrong. The board was already restless. Investors had tolerated his foundation because the publicity was too powerful to ignore, but marriage to a working-class single mother had stirred a storm in circles where appearances mattered more than truth. Ethan Cross was supposed to marry a senator's daughter, a heiress, someone polished and predictable. Instead, he had chosen Elena Ray, a woman who had scrubbed floors to keep her daughter fed. At the next quarterly meeting, the storm broke. The long oak table gleamed beneath the harsh light of the boardroom. Men and women in tailored suits sat stiffly, their eyes sharp, their folders filled with numbers meant to challenge. Ethan entered not in his usual armor of indifference, but with a quiet confidence that came from something deeper than profit margins. "Mr. Cross," one board member began, her voice clipped, "your personal decisions have become a distraction. The foundation drains resources. Your marriage has raised eyebrows among key partners. Shareholder confidence is at stake." Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped, his voice calm but firm. "Shareholder confidence is built on trust, and trust is built on integrity. If my personal life shows that I believe in the dignity of every human being, then our company is stronger for it. If that threatens someone's comfort, then perhaps they never understood what Cross Industries truly stands for." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some scowled, some shifted uncomfortably. One man slammed his pen down. "This company was built on strategy, not sentiment. You're risking billions for—" "For what?" Ethan cut in, his eyes cold now. "For a child who is laughed at for her shoes? For the truth that value isn't measured in currency alone? If that's a risk, then it's one I'll take every time." Silence fell, thick and electric. For years they had followed him because of his brilliance. Today they glimpsed something more dangerous: his conviction. When the meeting ended, the vote was split, some loyal, some furious. The war had only begun. That night, Ethan returned home later than usual, exhaustion etched into his shoulders. Elena was waiting, her arms folded, her eyes sharp. "What happened?" she asked. "They want me to choose," he admitted. "The company or everything else?" Her jaw tightened. "And what will you choose?" Ethan stepped closer, cupping her face gently. "I already did, the moment I put on those shoes." Her breath caught, her eyes shimmering. She kissed his palm, and in that small gesture, he found the strength to keep fighting. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Lila thrived in school, her once mocked shoes now displayed proudly in the foundation's lobby. Children visited from across the country, placing their own stories beside hers, shoes patched with duct tape, soles worn thin, fabric stitched by tired hands. Each pair became part of the exhibit, a testament to resilience. Media outlets ran features calling it "The Wall of Steps." Parents wept as they saw their children's struggles honored, not hidden. And through it all, Lila grew. By the time she turned 12, she no longer cowered at whispers. She walked into classrooms with her head high, her voice steady. When teachers asked her to speak about the shoes, she did so with a calm strength that surprised even Elena. "They're not ugly," she would say. "They're proof my mom never gave up." At 13, she stood beside Ethan at a gala, addressing a crowd of thousands. Her voice shook at first, but then steadied. "When I was little, I wanted to hide my shoes. Now I want the world to see them. Because they're more than shoes. They're a story, and stories can change people." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt something swell inside him, not pride for himself, but for her, for the girl who had been laughed at and now commanded a room. But not everyone applauded. In the shadows of success, envy stirred. Competitors accused the foundation of exploiting children for branding. Anonymous sources leaked private details of Elena's past, debts, eviction notices, moments of desperation twisted into scandal. Headlines screamed, "Cinderella or con artist?" Elena's hands trembled as she held the paper. "They'll destroy you because of me," she whispered. Ethan took the paper, crumpled it, and tossed it aside. "No, they'll destroy themselves trying." But the storm raged. News vans parked outside their home. Commentators debated Elena's worthiness on national television. Lila came home in tears again, not from classmates this time, but from strangers online who spewed cruelty in comment sections. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan found her sitting by the shoes in their case. "Why does it hurt so much?" she whispered. Ethan knelt beside her. "Because the truth scares people. Because when they see strength in places they tried to keep weak, it forces them to face themselves." She looked at him, her young face weary but determined. Then we have to keep wearing them, don't we? His chest tightened with pride. Yes, Lila, we do. The next week, at a press conference meant to address the so-called scandal, Ethan did something no one expected. He stepped onto the stage not alone, but with Elena at one side and Lila at the other. And instead of polished shoes, all three wore mismatched pairs stitched from scraps. The cameras flashed wildly. Reporters shouted questions. Ethan raised his hand for silence. "You want to talk about scandal?" he said, his voice steady. "Here it is. That a mother had to stitch shoes because the world left her no other choice. That a child was laughed at for something born of love. That wealth and power still pretend they are the only measures of worth. That is the scandal. And today we end it." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause so loud it shook the walls. From that moment the narrative shifted. What had been spun as weakness became unshakable strength. What had been mocked became a movement. Donations surged. Politicians scrambled to align themselves with the cause. The board, once so eager to oust him, suddenly claimed the foundation as proof of their company's moral leadership. But for Ethan, the victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the way Elena's hand squeezed his as they walked off the stage. It was in the way Lila stood tall, unflinching, before the cameras. Years passed. Lila grew into a young woman whose voice carried far beyond her classroom. She spoke at universities, at conferences, at global summits. She told her story not with bitterness, but with power. "Shoes stitched with love changed my life," she would say. "Now let's change millions more." Ethan watched her with awe. Elena watched her with pride. Together they watched her become more than a symbol. She became a leader, and always at the center of it all were the shoes, mismatched, stitched unevenly, born from poverty, yet carrying within them the thread that bound a family, a movement, a legacy. One evening, long after the lights of another gala had dimmed, Ethan stood in the foundation's headquarters, staring at the glass case where the shoes rested. His reflection shimmered faintly on the surface, but beside it he could see Lila's reflection too, now taller, older, but with the same bright eyes. "They look small now," she said quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "That's because you've grown, but they'll never be too small to remind us where we started." She slipped her hand into his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not walking away." He looked down at her, his heart full. "No, Lila, thank you for teaching me how to walk at all." And in the quiet hum of the foundation's halls, surrounded by thousands of donated shoes from children across the world, Ethan Cross, the man who had once believed value was measured only in numbers, finally understood. Wealth had built his empire, but love had built his life. And in the end, it was the shoes that told the story best. Years slipped past with the stealth of shadows, yet the shoes remained at the center of everything. The foundation grew beyond borders, its reach stretching into villages where children walked barefoot on burning sand, into refugee camps where shoes meant survival, into schools where one pair could mean the difference between attendance and absence. Every new distribution carried the story of one little girl, one mother, one pair of shoes stitched from scraps. But success, Ethan knew, was never without enemies. At a global summit in Geneva, where dignitaries gathered under chandeliers and flags hung in neat rows, Ethan stood on stage beside Lila, now 16, tall, her voice polished with years of practice. Cameras flashed, translators whispered, applause rose. She spoke not as a symbol, but as a leader, her words weaving hope across languages. Yet in the back of the hall, a group of journalists clustered, their whispers sharp. They weren't here to celebrate, they were here to dig. By morning, headlines screamed across the world, CEO's stepdaughter benefiting from non-profit funds. Photos of Lila boarding a plane circulated online, twisted into evidence of excess. Reports claimed the foundation's budget was being misused, its mission corrupted. Ethan sat in his hotel room staring at the tablet glowing with accusations. Elena stood by the window, her arms crossed tight, her face pale. "They'll believe it," she said quietly. "They always do. People love to tear down what they can't control." "They'll try," Ethan replied, his voice low, dangerous. "But this time, they won't win." Back home, the Foundation's headquarters became a battlefield. Lawyers swarmed, auditors demanded records, cameras camped outside the glass doors. Employees whispered in corridors, their loyalty tested by the weight of scandal. Ethan called an emergency meeting, the boardroom filled with uneasy faces, some avoiding his gaze, some outright hostile. "You've jeopardized everything," one man snapped. "This foundation was a shield for our brand. Now it's an anchor pulling us under." Ethan's eyes burned cold. This foundation was never a shield. It was a promise. If you thought it was branding, you never understood it in the first place. Documents slapped onto the table, pages fluttering. "The press has numbers, Ethan. Flights, accommodations, events. This girl of yours looks like she's enjoying luxury on donor dollars." Lila's name on their lips made his hands tighten into fists. He leaned forward, his voice lethal in its calm. "That girl has spoken in more schools, more shelters, more war zones than any of you could stomach for a single day. Every dollar spent to get her there was an investment in hope. And every cent is accounted for. You want numbers? You'll get them, but don't ever mistake her work for indulgence again." Silence slammed down on the room. For once, no one had an answer. The audits cleared them, of course. The accusations dissolved under the weight of meticulous records. But the damage lingered. Elena felt it in the whispers at grocery stores, in the sidelong glances at school meetings. Lila felt it in the venom online, the cruel comments that cut deeper than any childhood taunt ever had. One night, Ethan found her curled in bed, the glow of her phone lighting her tear-streaked face. He took it gently from her hands, set it aside, and sat on the edge of the mattress. "Why do they hate me?" she whispered. "They don't hate you," he said softly. "They hate what you represent. You remind them that their excuses are lies. You remind them that love can outlast power, that terrifies people who build their lives on sand." Her lip trembled. "I don't want to be strong all the time." Ethan's chest ached. He reached for her hand. "Then don't be. Let me be strong for you when you can't. That's what family is." She leaned into him, her tears soaking his shirt. And Ethan, the man once praised for his unshakable composure, felt his own eyes burn. But storms, he knew, could forge steel. By 18, Lila walked onto stages, not as a girl defined by shoes, but as a woman defined by voice. She spoke with fire, her words cutting through cynicism like a blade. She didn't shy away from the story of humiliation. She embraced it. "I was laughed at," she would tell crowds. "But the laughers are gone, the shoes remain, and so do I." Ethan watched from the wings, pride swelling. Elena watched from the audience, her hand pressed to her lips, tears glimmering. After one particularly powerful speech at the United Nations, Lila returned backstage, breathless, radiant. She threw her arms around Ethan. "We did it," she whispered. He hugged her tightly. "No, Lila, you did it." Elena joined them, her eyes meeting Ethan's over their daughter's shoulder. For the first time, there was no shadow in her gaze, only light. But Ethan's battles weren't over. Age crept into his reflection, lines deepening, hair silvering. The company he had built became restless again, shareholders whispering of succession. Some demanded he step aside. Some waited like wolves, ready to carve his legacy into pieces. He sat alone one night in his office, the city lights stretching endlessly, the shoes in their glass case beside him. He thought of the boy he once was, the man he became, the family he found. He thought of wealth measured not in billions, but in moments, Lila's laughter, Elena's hand in his, the sound of shoes too small but stitched with love. And he smiled. The next morning, he announced his decision. He would step down as CEO, not in defeat, but in choice. He would dedicate the rest of his life to the foundation, to the movement born from a little girl's humiliation and a mother's hands. The world gasped. Stocks trembled. Analysts called it madness. But as Ethan walked off the stage for the last time as CEO, Elena and Lila were waiting in the wings. He slipped his hand into Elena's, his arm around Lila's shoulders. Cameras flashed, questions flew, chaos roared, but he heard none of it. All he heard was Lila's voice, steady, certain. "We'll keep walking, right?" Ethan looked at her, at the shoes behind the glass, at the life ahead. "Yes," he said, his voice full, "always." And together they stepped forward. Years passed with the steady rhythm of footsteps, each one carrying the family further from the cracked concrete steps where it had all begun, yet never so far that the memory faded. Lila grew, not just in height but in presence, her once shy posture replaced by a poise that drew people to her. At 19 she entered university, not under her stepfather's name, but her own, determined to prove that her worth was not borrowed, but earned. She studied international relations, her essays sharp, her debates fiery. Her professors often left silent as her words cut deeper than they expected from someone her age. Yet every night, no matter where she was, a pair of mismatched shoes sat by her bed as a reminder of the roots she would never abandon. Ethan and Elena adjusted to this new chapter in their own ways. For Ethan, the absence of boardrooms left him lighter, freer. He dedicated himself fully to the foundation, traveling to countries where poverty pressed on children's feet with brutal force. He walked dirt paths in Africa, slums in South America, refugee camps in Europe. His polished shoes left behind as he wore the simple sandals distributed by his own programs. Elena traveled with him sometimes, her presence quiet but grounding, reminding him that compassion needed no stage. Other times she stayed home, managing local initiatives, cooking meals for volunteers, her leadership understated but essential. She was no longer just the woman who scrubbed floors. She was the co-founder of a movement. But power, Ethan knew, was never ceded without challenge. Competitors who once feared him now dismissed him as sentimental. Politicians tried to use the foundation for their own agendas. Journalists dug through every corner of their past, desperate for scandal. And then came the betrayal from within. A trusted executive, once lifted by Ethan himself, embezzled funds, twisting donations into personal gain. The revelation hit like a storm, headlines screaming that the foundation was compromised. Ethan sat in his office, his hands pressed to his temples, as lawyers and advisors shouted solutions. But all he could think of was the faces of children who would go barefoot because trust had been broken. Elena entered the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This doesn't erase what you've done," she said softly. "It just means you have to fight again." Her words steadied him, and fight he did. Investigations cleared his own name, the thief imprisoned, but the lesson burned into his soul. Goodness was never safe from attack, but it was always worth defending. Lila returned home for the summer after her second year of university to find her parents wearier than she remembered. Ethan's hair had gone more silver, Elena's lines deeper, but their eyes were bright. One evening at dinner, she set down her fork and looked at them both. "Let me take some of this from you," she said. "The foundation is mine too. Let me stand where you've been standing." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his pride and his fear warring. "You'll carry it further than I ever could," he finally said. And so she began, not with a title, not with fanfare, but by listening. She sat with donors, with children, with mothers stitching shoes by candlelight, learning what her parents had always known, that dignity lived in details. By 25, Leela was the face of the foundation. Her speeches electrified crowds across continents. She refused luxury, staying in modest hostels when she traveled, walking barefoot with children to show she understood. Photographers followed her, but she never performed. What they captured was real. Her laughter with children in dusty courtyards, her tears as she listened to mothers recount loss, her steady gaze as she challenged presidents and CEOs to do more. Journalists who once sneered now called her the voice of a generation. Ethan watched with awe, his heart swelling each time she spoke. Elena watched with quiet pride, her hands often clasped together, whispering thanks to a life that had once offered her nothing and now had given her everything. But time pressed forward with relentless hands. Ethan's health began to falter. He ignored the first signs, shortness of breath, fatigue, but Elena noticed. One night, as he sat staring at the shoes in their glass case, she placed her hand over his. "You can't carry everything anymore," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes tired but tender. "I don't need to," he replied. "She's carrying it now." And she was. Lila had grown into the leader he always hoped she would be. Fierce and compassionate, unyielding, yet gentle. The world looked at her and saw not just a continuation of his work, but a brighter, bolder version of it. When the day came that Ethan could no longer attend events, Lila brought the events to him. She sat by his bedside, her laptop glowing, showing him live streams of children receiving shoes in countries he would never visit again. His eyes misted as he watched. "You've made it bigger than I ever dreamed," he whispered. Lila squeezed his hand. "Because you showed me how to dream in the first place." Elena stood by the window, tears streaming silently down her face, watching the two people she loved most bind themselves together in words too heavy for the air. Ethan's final public appearance came on a quiet afternoon, not at a summit or gala, but at a small school very much like the one where it had all begun. Frail but determined, he insisted on walking into that gymnasium where children waited eagerly. He wore no suit, only simple clothes, and on his feet once again were Lila's mismatched shoes. The children gasped, teachers whispered, cameras flashed, but he ignored it all. He spoke softly, his voice carrying more weight in its fragility than in its old power. "They laughed at these once," he said, lifting his foot slightly. "But they don't laugh anymore, not because of me, because of what they stand for. And so will you. Whatever the world mocks you for today, let it. One day it will be the reason you rise." The gymnasium erupted in applause, but Ethan only smiled faintly, his eyes on Lila and Elena in the front row. He knew it was the last time he would stand before a crowd, and he was at peace. When he passed, it was not with headlines or trumpets, but with quiet. Elena held his hand, Lila on the other side, their tears mingling with whispered prayers. The shoes rested on the table beside him, the last thing his eyes saw. The world mourned loudly, newspapers running front-page tributes, leaders issuing statements. But for his family, grief was private, tender. They buried him with no extravagance, only love, his coffin carried by the very children whose lives he had changed. But death was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his legacy. Under Lila's leadership, the foundation exploded into a global force. Governments partnered, corporations followed, but she never let them dilute the message. She spoke of her mother's hands, of her stepfather's vow, of shoes stitched in love. She carried their story into every hall of power, her voice unflinching. Elena, though aged, remained her anchor, her wisdom shaping decisions, her presence steady when the world's storms threatened. Decades later, long after Ethan's name had become legend, Lila walked into the Foundation's headquarters, now a towering glass building filled with light. She paused at the exhibit that had grown over the years, thousands of shoes from children across the world, each one with a story. At the center, still under glass, still mismatched, still stitched unevenly, sat the pair that began it all. She touched the glass gently, her reflection merging with the shoes. Beside her, Elena, frail but smiling, whispered, "He'd be proud." Lila nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We're still walking, Mama, just like he said." And as she turned to step onto another stage, into another room where voices waited to be changed, the shoes remained, silent, small, imperfect, yet more powerful than any crown, any fortune, any empire. Because they carried within them the truth that had bound a family, transformed a man, and ignited a world. That love stitched in scraps can outlast wealth. That dignity born in humiliation can rise into glory. That sometimes the smallest steps create the loudest echoes. And so the story walked on, long after those who lived it had gone, carried by the feet of children who would never again be laughed at for what they wore, but celebrated for the courage with which they walked. Years continued their march, carving new lines into faces, etching wisdom into hearts. Lila aged into her 40s with the grace of someone who had carried both burden and blessing from a young age. The foundation had become not just an organization, but a movement woven into the fabric of the world. In city squares, in rural villages, in refugee camps, in schools, children carried shoes bearing the logo of Step Forward, and with them carried the story of the girl who once cried on the steps of her school because her shoes were mocked. That girl had grown into a woman whose voice bent the ears of presidents, and whose heart still bent low to tie the laces of a child. At home, she balanced her life not only as a leader but as a mother. She and her partner, a kind-hearted teacher named Marcus, had 2 children of their own, a boy with Ethan's eyes, sharp and curious, and a girl with Elena's quiet determination. They grew up surrounded by stories of the shoes, not as legend, but as family history. Bedtime stories often ended not with fairy tales, but with the retelling of the day their grandmother stitched fabric by candlelight and their mother stood up to the world. The shoes became their inheritance, not of leather and thread, but of courage. Elena, by then in her 80s, lived with them in a room filled with sunlight and photographs. She watched her grandchildren play, her eyes soft with memories. Sometimes she would hold their small shoes in her hands and whisper to herself, marveling at how something so simple had carried them so far. Her health weakened, her steps slowed, but her spirit remained steady. Lila often sat with her in the afternoons, holding her hand, listening as she spoke of the years she thought she would not survive, the years when humiliation threatened to crush her, the years when Ethan had walked into their lives and changed everything. "He didn't save us," she would say, her voice thin but firm. "He stood with us, and that made all the difference." One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Elena called Lila and Marcus into her room. The children played quietly on the floor, unaware of the weight in the air. Elena's voice was frail, but her eyes were clear. "Promise me," she said. "Promise me the shoes will always remind people not just of Ethan, not just of you, but of every mother who stitches love into scraps, every child who endures laughter and still stands tall." Tears slid down Lila's cheeks as she nodded, clutching her mother's hand. "I promise, Mama, always." Elena smiled faintly, her breath slowing, and in that final moment she whispered, "Then I can rest." She passed as she had lived, quietly, with dignity, leaving behind a legacy that stretched far beyond the walls of that room. The world mourned her as the woman whose hands had started it all. Newspapers called her the mother of the movement. But for Lila, she was simply Mama, the woman who had worked her fingers raw so her daughter wouldn't go barefoot. They buried her beside Ethan, the shoes placed between their graves as if to remind the earth itself of what they had built together. Crowds gathered, but Lila kept her grief private, holding her children close, whispering to them that their grandmother had sewn the threads of their lives long before they were born. After Elena's passing, the foundation entered a new era. Lila oversaw the creation of a global museum in the heart of the city, a vast structure of glass and steel that seemed to breathe light. Inside, the wall of steps stretched across entire galleries, shoes from every corner of the world, each accompanied by a story. Visitors walked silently, reverently, through aisles of fabric, leather, rubber, scraps, all testaments to resilience. At the center of it all, under the softest light, were the original shoes, still mismatched, still uneven, still sacred. People came from around the world to see them, not as artifacts of fashion, but as relics of dignity. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Parents wiped tears from their cheeks. Leaders stood in awe before the simple truth stitched in thread. Lila often stood there alone after hours, gazing at them, remembering the sting of humiliation, the warmth of Ethan's voice, the strength of her mother's hands. One night her daughter joined her, slipping her small hand into hers. "Mama," the girl whispered, "why do people care so much about old shoes?" Lila knelt, her eyes level with her daughter's. "Because they remind us that nothing is too small to change the world, and because they were made from love. Love lasts longer than anything else." The girl nodded, her young eyes wide with understanding, and in that moment Lila knew the story would never end. As years turned into decades, the shoes became more than a story. They became a movement enshrined in history. Textbooks told of the girl laughed at for her shoes, and the billionaire who wore them to remind the world of value. University lectures dissected the case as a turning point in corporate responsibility. Plays and films retold the story, sometimes with embellishment, sometimes stripped to its raw core, but always with the shoes at its heart. And every retelling, every reminder carried the truth forward, that humiliation can be transformed into dignity, that poverty can birth legacy, that love stitched into scraps can outlast empires. When Lila grew old, her hair silvering, her steps slowing, she often found herself back at the museum, standing before the glass. Sometimes she went alone, sometimes with her children, sometimes with her grandchildren, each time feeling the weight of generations pressing gently on her shoulders. One afternoon, after giving a speech to a group of young activists, she lingered at the exhibit long after the crowd had left. A janitor, sweeping quietly in the corner, approached her hesitantly. "My mother made me shoes once," he said softly. "They were ugly. I threw them away. I wish I hadn't." Lila turned, her eyes kind, her voice steady. "They weren't ugly. They were love. Never forget that." The man nodded, tears glistening in his eyes, and in that small exchange she knew the story was still alive, still doing its work. In her final years, Lila wrote her memoirs, not tales of wealth or fame, but stories of shoes. Each chapter carried the voice of a child whose life had been changed, a mother who had stitched in the dark, a father who had walked miles to keep his child in school. She ended the book not with her own words, but with her mother's. "He didn't save us. He stood with us." The book became a bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, read in classrooms, quoted on protest signs, whispered in quiet rooms where hope felt scarce. When her time came, she passed surrounded by family, her children and grandchildren holding her hands. On the table beside her bed sat the shoes, not behind glass, not in a museum, but right there, close enough to touch. Her daughter leaned close, whispering, "We'll keep walking, Mama." Lila smiled faintly, her eyes closing, her final breath carrying peace. The world mourned again, but her legacy did not end. It grew. Decades later, long after those who had lived the story were gone, the shoes remained. Encased now in a global monument visited by millions each year, they stood not as fabric and thread, but as eternal witnesses. Children from across the world pressed their faces to the glass, wide-eyed, hearing the story for the first time. Teachers told them, "This is what love looks like when it refuses to die." Parents whispered to their children, "Remember this when the world laughs at you." And each child, each parent, each visitor walked away with a piece of the story stitched into their hearts. The shoes had begun as scraps. They had been mocked, ridiculed, dismissed. But in the end, they outlasted wealth, outlasted power, outlasted time itself. They had stitched together a family, a movement, a world, and their story walked on step by step into eternity. Centuries do not always look like centuries while you are living them. They arrive day by day, the way dawn arrives, too slowly to notice until the room has changed color. So it was with the years that followed, years that carried the shoes from a glass case in a city museum to a quiet kind of immortality. The story outlived the city's tallest towers, outlived currencies and borders and the names of companies that once believed themselves permanent. It outlived everything except the need of a child to take a first step without shame. In the 2nd century, after Elena sewed those mismatched pieces together, a girl named Mara learned the story in a classroom that had no walls. Lessons streamed through sunlit air to a hillside where goats grazed, and her grandmother mended a woven basket with fingers that could still tie knots as small as seeds. The teacher's voice came through a tiny speaker clipped to a sapling branch, telling of a child humiliated for her shoes, and a man who wore those shoes on a stage so bright it could have blinded him if not for the memory of cracked steps and quiet promises. Mara listened without blinking. When the lesson ended, she shut off the speaker and looked at her feet. Her sandals were cut from a tire and laced with twine. She wiggled her toes and felt the press of earth. The story had crossed oceans and time to find her here, and it did not scrape or sting. It fitted over her like shade fits the skin. That evening she asked her grandmother for scraps of cloth, and together they stitched a pouch to carry to school. They stitched slowly, without apology, and when she finished, she held the crooked seams up to the light and smiled in a way that felt like standing taller. In a port city, rebuilt after waters rose and receded and rose again, a boy named Ivo wandered into a gallery to escape the afternoon heat and found himself walking along a corridor of glass. Shoes hovered before him like constellations, boots scuffed by mountain roads, slippers dyed with bark, sneakers patched with plastic thread. He paused when a guide whispered to a group of travelers that the oldest pair, the one at the center, the one made of mismatched cloth, had not been moved in 200 years, except once, when floods licked the museum's threshold and volunteers lifted the case by hand, their arms trembling, their breaths held, as if carrying an infant through smoke. Ivo took off his own shoes and held them in his hands. They were new, a gift from an aunt who worked nights. He stood barefoot on the cool stone floor and imagined the girl who had once tried to shrink inside a desk. He imagined the man who remembered. He imagined the mother with a candle. When he put his shoes back on, they felt lighter, as if laced with something invisible. In a country stitched back together after a civil war, a council debated whether to spend money on a monument to the founding general, or on a network of footbridges that would let children cross rivers safely during the rainy season. The vote was tied until a woman at the edge of the room, quiet and practical, set a small object on the table. It was a child's slipper sewn from 2 different shirts, one blue, one white. She said, "Only this. A monument is a story made of stone. A bridge is a story made of steps." The council voted for bridges. Months later, when the first rain came and children crossed wooden planks above a boiling river, someone painted 2 tiny shoes on the railing in mismatched colors. The rain did not wash them away. On the other side of the world, in a city that once pretended it could never crack, a young architect named Noor won a commission to redesign the square outside the Global Museum. She proposed no statue, no fountain, no grand arch. She drew instead 1,000 lines radiating from the museum doors like threads, each leading to a pair of footprints stamped into the stone. Small, large, heavy, light, some turned inward, some outward, all moving away from the center toward streets and schools and bakeries and bus stops. The panel asked her what the square would commemorate. She said it would commemorate the leaving, not the rooms where we are admired, but the roads where we are needed. When it opened, people walked those threads like paths in a garden and felt their feet align with something older than fame. There were years when the shoes seemed to disappear beneath new stories, as new needs demanded new words. There were years when the museum's funding ran low, and the glass fogged in winter because the heat clicked off. There were years when the city's grid blinked out, and the plaza lay sleeping under a quilt of snow littered with footprints and bicycle tracks. Each time, a janitor, a guard, a grandmother, a teenager with a volunteer badge would wipe the glass clean and stand before the case as if standing before a well. Sometimes they prayed, sometimes they laughed, sometimes they put a hand to their chest and just breathed. No petition was too small to bring there, no gratitude too ordinary. In a classroom that looked like a kitchen because it was, a teacher named Rosa spread a map on the table and asked her students to mark the roads they took each morning to get to school. One child drew a straight line from a shelter across a park. Another drew a path that looped around a vacant lot and backtracked through an alley where a neighbor watched from a stoop. Rosa told them the story of the shoes, and then asked each child to write the name of the person who made it possible for them to be sitting at that table: a bus driver, a social worker, a cousin who set a bowl of cereal on the counter and kissed a forehead. They wrote and read, and then tied the papers with string and put them in a shoebox. Years later, when those children were scattered across the city, and across other cities too, that box sat on a shelf behind a row of cookbooks and a jar of buttons, and when the lights flickered during a storm, Rosa would take it down and hold it close as if holding a pulse.